A smile can hide a very sharp secret. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The afternoon of the church fête had been one of those soft, uncertain English days where the rain came and went in gentle whispers, leaving the air washed clean and the roses in the vicarage garden heavy-headed with moisture. By evening, St. Mary Mead lay under a thin, transparent twilight that seemed to have been arranged by a particularly tidy mind, every cottage and gatepost and privet hedge neatly in its place, as peaceful as a scene painted on a chocolate box. Miss Jane Marple sat in her wicker chair beneath the laburnum tree, watching the last of the fête-goers drift away across the vicarage lawn. Her pale blue eyes, still remarkably sharp despite her years, had missed very little during the afternoon's festivities. She had observed the way young Tom Ellison hovered about Susan Trent, fumbling with tickets for the hoopla stall and reddening most unbecomingly whenever Susan turned her head. She had noted Mrs. Price Ridley's bristling annoyance when her lemon curd came second to that of Mrs. Sampson, whose husband ran the grocer's shop and was not, in Mrs. Price Ridley's estimation, the sort of person whose wife ought to win anything at all. Most particularly, she had noticed that Griselda Clement looked tired. The vicar's wife was not, and never had been, in the least like a vicar's wife in stories. She was too tall, too modern, too inclined to laugh at precisely the wrong moment. Today she wore a frock of pale green that did not in the least conceal the fact that it had cost more than a vicar's wife's dress was generally supposed to cost, and her fair hair had escaped in a charming, untidy way from under a hat which she had declared earlier in the week that she absolutely loathed. "It's been rather a business, hasn't it, dear?" Miss Marple said gently as Griselda came to sink down on the grass beside her chair, kicking off her shoes in a most unecclesiastical manner. "My feet are positively screaming," Griselda replied, stretching her legs out with obvious relief. Why does fundraising always mean balancing trays of teacups on damp turf while listening to Mrs. Price Ridley explain how she would have organized everything so much better? Miss Marple smiled her soft, almost apologetic smile that so few people recognized as an indication that she had been quietly storing up facts. "People do so enjoy being useful," she observed mildly, "in other people's work." Griselda leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment. A little line appeared between her brows, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime studying the small betrayals of human expression, saw it clearly. There was something troubling the young woman beyond mere physical exhaustion. "You are worried about something," Miss Marple said, not as a question but as a gentle statement of fact. Griselda's eyes flew open. For just an instant, Miss Marple glimpsed something that looked remarkably like fear before Griselda's natural vivacity reasserted itself. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, with forced lightness. "The usual domestic disasters. The boiler's making those dreadful noises again, and Len will insist on taking in paying guests when we can barely manage the housekeeping as it is." She did not mention, though the thought ran through her mind with practised swiftness, the matter of Mr. Latimer's missing payment, or the strange conversation she had overheard between him and that peculiar Mr. Vance who had recently taken Blackwood Hall. She certainly did not speak of the letter that had arrived that morning, written in a hand she recognized but had hoped never to see again. Miss Marple, if she had been told of these troubles, might have murmured something sympathetic about the difficulties of managing a household on a clergyman's income. Privately, however, she would have compared Mr. Latimer to a certain under-gardener she had once known, who had possessed the same quiet hands and smooth voice, and who had borrowed half-crowns that were never repaid. But Griselda said nothing of substance, and so Miss Marple merely patted her shoulder and rose with some effort to make her way home through the damp lanes. The vicarage settled into its evening routine with the comfortable predictability of a house long accustomed to the rhythms of parish life. The Reverend Leonard Clement, exhausted by a day of passing teacups and mislaying small coins, fell into the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who believed firmly in providence. Griselda, however, lay awake in the darkness, her mind turning over problems that seemed to multiply like shadows in the corners of her bedroom. It was just past midnight when she heard it, a sound that cut through the still night air like the thin tearing of silk. One sharp, high, utterly terrified scream, too brief to be repeated, cut off as suddenly as it had begun. Griselda sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment she considered waking Leonard, going to the window, calling out into the darkness. Then the practical side of her mind, trained by years of minor domestic crises, began to fold the incident away into a corner labelled, very likely, nothing. Sound carried strangely on damp nights, she told herself. It might have been some young person on the road, or children playing foolish games, or merely a cat in distress. If she raised an alarm over nothing, she would look absurd. And if it was something serious, well, what exactly was she supposed to do in her nightgown and bare feet? "I'll say nothing about it," she decided, settling back against her pillows with a curious combination of resolution and weariness that comes to people in the small hours. These things are always exaggerated. One imagines things in the dark. By morning, with breakfast to manage and a note from Mrs. Price Ridley about the proper allocation of fête proceeds, Griselda had almost convinced herself that she had imagined the entire incident. She thought of it only once, briefly, dismissing it with an inward shrug as she hurried about her morning duties. It was not until Dr. Haydock's motor car came racing up the drive, followed closely by Inspector Slack's official vehicle, that the cold, sick realization crept over her. When they found the body in the ditch beyond the vicarage gate, Griselda remembered with perfect, terrible clarity the sound she had heard in the night. She had heard the scream, and she had said nothing. Now, as she watched the inspector's grim face and saw the sheet-covered form being carried away, she wondered if her silence had made her something far worse than a mere witness to tragedy. The thought settled in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of fear through everything she had believed about herself and her quiet, ordinary life. The news travelled through St. Mary Mead with that peculiar velocity reserved for tragedy in small villages, moving faster than any motor car or telephone call, transmitted through glances over garden fences and whispered conferences at shop counters. By 10 o'clock that morning, every household knew that a body had been discovered near the vicarage gate, and by 10:30, the victim had been identified with grim certainty as Mr. Gerald Latimer, the paying guest who had taken rooms with the Clements 3 weeks prior. Miss Marple heard the news from her maid, who had it from the butcher's boy, who had been loitering near the vicarage when the police arrived. She received the information with that particular stillness that came over her when something disturbed the natural order of village life, setting down her teacup with great care. "Dear me," she said quietly, "Mr. Latimer, how very unfortunate." By noon she had made her way to the vicarage, carrying a basket containing a jar of her special honey and a small pot of chicken broth, those universal offerings that allowed one to call upon a household in distress without appearing merely curious. She found Griselda in the morning room, pale and distracted, her hands twisting in her lap with a nervous energy that Miss Marple noted with interest. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself into a chair that commanded an excellent view of both Griselda's face and the garden beyond, "what a terrible shock this must be for you." Griselda's colour rose slightly. "It's perfectly dreadful To think of it happening so close to the house, and we heard nothing, nothing at all." The emphasis on the last words struck Miss Marple as curious, the sort of overstatement that often concealed its opposite. "The police are quite certain it was not an accident, I suppose?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone suggesting nothing more than mild concern. "Inspector Slack says he was struck on the head," Griselda replied, lowering her voice. "They found him in the ditch, but Dr. Haydock says he died where he fell, sometime after midnight. His pocketbook was missing, so the inspector thinks it was robbery, but—" She trailed off, biting her lip. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting. "But you have doubts?" "Mr. Latimer was very pleasant. Too pleasant, perhaps. The maids adored him. He had that way of listening as though everything one said was terribly clever. But there were things—" Griselda hesitated. "He was behind with his payments, for one thing. And I caught him once in the kitchen garden, speaking to Mary. She was crying. When he saw me, he laughed and said he was only giving her brother advice about getting a place in London. But Mary wouldn't look at me afterward." "Young men," Miss Marple observed mildly, "have such a deplorable habit of giving advice to pretty housemaids. It so seldom turns out to be in the housemaid's best interest. Had he any visitors?" "Only one that I know of. A Mr. Vance came to see him last week. The gentleman who's taken Blackwood Hall. They spoke in Mr. Latimer's room for perhaps half an hour, and when Mr. Vance left he looked rather angry, though he was perfectly civil when he passed me in the hall." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her eyes had sharpened. She knew Mr. Vance by reputation, a man whose treatment of the Dawson family when they couldn't pay their rent had not endeared him to the neighbourhood. Before Griselda could continue, heavy footsteps announced Inspector Slack's arrival. He barely acknowledged Miss Marple's presence, addressing himself to Griselda with brusque efficiency. "Mrs. Clement, I'll need to speak with you again about the deceased's movements yesterday evening. The case seems straightforward enough, robbery gone wrong, but we must be thorough." Miss Marple rose quietly, preparing to take her leave, but not before she had observed the way Griselda's hands had begun to tremble at the inspector's words. There was something the young woman was not saying, some knowledge she was keeping locked away behind her frightened eyes. As Miss Marple made her way home through the village, she reflected on the morning's revelations. The official theory pointed to robbery, clean and simple. But in her experience, things that appeared simple in this world very rarely were. Mr. Latimer had been a man with debts and secrets, charming housemaids and receiving angry visitors. Most tellingly, he had gone out the previous evening to take the air. And people, Miss Marple knew, very rarely took the air without meaning to meet someone. The question was not whether Mr. Latimer had arranged a meeting that night, but with whom. And why Griselda Clement, who claimed to have heard nothing, looked like a woman carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. Silence, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, was often far more revealing than speech. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the curious position of being invited to tea by no fewer than 3 separate households, each invitation transparently motivated by the desire to discuss the tragedy while appearing to do nothing of the sort. She accepted Mrs. Price Ridley's invitation, as that lady's drawing-room commanded the best view of village comings and goings, and her tongue, though sharp, was remarkably accurate in matters of observable fact. Mrs. Price Ridley wasted no time on preliminaries. "Naturally, one feels for poor Griselda," she announced, pouring tea, with the decisive movements of a woman who had never doubted her own opinions. "But one must wonder at the wisdom of taking in paying guests when one knows nothing whatsoever about their backgrounds. Inspector Slack believes it was robbery, of course, a tramp, most likely, lurking in the woods." How convenient that would be, Miss Marple observed gently, accepting her cup. Though in my experience, tramps are generally more interested in dry barns and kitchen scraps than in attacking healthy young men in the dark. Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of having superior information. "Ah, but you haven't heard the latest. I saw Mr. Latimer myself on 3 separate occasions, walking toward Blackwood Hall well after dark, and once I saw him coming from the direction of the Trent cottage at nearly 11 o'clock. A respectable man does not make such calls at such hours." This information settled into Miss Marple's mind with interest. The Trent cottage housed Susan Trent and her widowed mother, and Susan was precisely the sort of pretty, vulnerable girl who attracted the wrong kind of attention from charming gentlemen. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who had been summoned under the pretext of discussing Mrs. Price Ridley's persistent neuralgia. The doctor, a blunt, sensible man, nevertheless found himself drawn into discussion about the deceased. "Healthy young fellow," he said, accepting tea with the air of a man who would have preferred something stronger. The blow to the head was decisive. Single strike with a smooth, heavy object. Not frenzied, not the work of someone in a panic. And there's the matter of his shoes. "His shoes?" Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward eagerly. "Barely muddy, despite the rain we'd had, and the fact that he supposedly walked from the vicarage to where he was found. It's as though he met someone very close to the vicarage, walked only a short distance, and was struck down almost immediately." Miss Marple's needles had stopped moving. That would suggest he knew his attacker, someone he had arranged to meet, perhaps. After the doctor departed, Miss Marple made her way toward the high street, moving with the deceptively aimless gait of an elderly lady with nothing more pressing on her mind than the purchase of wool. At the post office, she spotted Mary, the vicarage maid, clutching a letter to her chest with desperate intensity. The girl looked around furtively before hastily shoving the envelope into the pillar box, then turned toward the woods with the jerky, frantic movements of someone consumed by fear. It was at the Women's Institute meeting that evening that the most damaging revelation emerged. Mrs. Bartlett, whose husband had seen the body before it was moved, mentioned, very reluctantly, and only after being pressed, that Mr. Latimer's appearance had been distinctly irregular. "His collar was missing altogether," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with importance, "and his shirt was all rumpled and open at the throat. Now what do you make of that?" An uncomfortable silence followed. The implications were clear enough: a clandestine meeting, a quarrel, violence. Miss Marple observed the faces around her, Susan Trent staring fixedly at her embroidery, young Tom Ellison visible through the window, pacing the green like a tormented soul. As the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple noticed a large motor car purring to a halt outside the Blue Boar. Mr. Vance of Blackwood Hall stepped out, and his demeanour struck her as remarkably odd. A man who had visited the victim only days before might be expected to show some strain upon hearing of the murder. Yet Mr. Vance appeared utterly composed, lighting a cigarette with steady hands, his eyes sweeping the village street not with concern, but with cold calculation. Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The official theory pointed to a wandering thief, but the evidence suggested something far more personal: planned meetings, missing collars, fearful servants, and a man whose lack of surprise spoke volumes. As she unlatched her garden gate, something caught her eye, a small, muddy object in the grass near her hedge, evidently dropped in haste. She stooped with some difficulty to retrieve it. A distinctive mother-of-pearl button with a small chip on one side. She held it in her palm, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. She had seen this button before, and recently. It most certainly did not belong to any wandering tramp. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Mr. Latimer had been a man with secrets, making mysterious visits and inspiring fear in those who knew him best. His death had been calculated, not random, and someone in their quiet village was working very hard indeed to ensure the truth remained buried. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to the village with the brisk efficiency of a man who believed he had untangled the threads of murder with admirable speed. He found Miss Marple in her garden, where she was examining her roses with the same careful attention she applied to all puzzles requiring proper understanding. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he announced, his satisfaction evident in every line of his bearing. "I believe we have our man. Young Tom Ellison has been taken into custody for questioning, and I expect we shall have this matter wrapped up by evening." Miss Marple straightened slowly, her pale eyes thoughtful. "Tom Ellison, the young man from the garage. How very interesting, Inspector." "Indeed it is. We've discovered he was in considerable debt, gambling debts to be precise, owes nearly £50 to some unsavoury characters in Much Benham." Mr. Latimer had learned of this and was threatening to inform Tom's employer. The boy would have lost his position, you see. Last night, when pressed, he admitted to being out near the vicarage on the night of the murder, though he claims he was merely walking because he couldn't sleep. Miss Marple turned the mother-of-pearl button over in her pocket, feeling its smooth surface and the small, telling chip along one edge. She had not mentioned this discovery to the inspector, partly because she was not yet certain of its significance, and partly because she had learned that policemen, particularly those as convinced of their own cleverness as Inspector Slack, rarely welcomed observations that complicated their neat theories. "The murder weapon?" she inquired gently. "Not recovered yet, but that's hardly unusual in cases like this. Likely threw it in the river. The important thing is motive and opportunity, and young Ellison had both in abundance." Inspector Slack rocked back on his heels with evident pride. A clear case of desperation driving a man to violence. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in her garden chair, considering the matter. Tom Ellison was indeed desperate, and desperate people did foolish things. But murder, particularly the calculated sort that Dr. Haydock had described, required more than desperation. It required a certain hardness of character, a willingness to extinguish another human life with cold efficiency. Tom, for all his faults, had always struck her as fundamentally weak rather than wicked. Weak men ran away from their problems. They rarely turned and fought with such deadly precision. Her meditation was interrupted by Tom himself, who came hurrying along the lane with the haggard look of a man who had not slept. When he saw her, he stopped abruptly, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy caught in mischief. "Morning, Miss Marple," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "Good morning, Tom. You look troubled." Tom glanced toward the woods where police constables could be seen moving methodically through the undergrowth. "Everyone's talking, aren't they, about Mr. Latimer, saying he was meeting someone that night?" "People will talk," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "especially when things are not quite clear." "I saw him," Tom blurted out suddenly, the words tumbling over themselves in their haste to escape. "That night, before it happened. He wasn't alone. He was arguing with someone near the old quarry path. I couldn't see who it was, too dark, but I heard voices, angry ones, and then I saw someone running away toward the village." Miss Marple set down her gardening shears with careful precision. "Did you tell Inspector Slack this?" Tom's face went white. "I can't. If I say I was there, if I admit I saw the argument, they'll think I did it, and Susan—" He stopped abruptly, biting his lip. "You are fond of Miss Trent?" Miss Marple observed gently. "She didn't do anything wrong," Tom cried, his voice cracking with emotion. But that Latimer fellow wouldn't leave her alone, always watching her, following her about the village. I told him to stay away from her, told him if he didn't. He trailed off, realizing the implications of his words. Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered Susan Trent at the village shop, where the girl was purchasing stamps with hands that trembled visibly. When she saw Miss Marple, Susan attempted a smile that failed entirely to reach her frightened eyes. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing around the empty shop, "is it true what they're saying, that the police are asking about Mr. Latimer's acquaintances?" "They are making various inquiries, my dear." Susan leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He had something of mine, a locket that belonged to my grandmother. He took it, said it was just a jest, but he wouldn't give it back. He said I had to come to his room to retrieve it. That night." "And did you go?" "No, I was too frightened. I stayed in my room all evening. But now if they find it among his things—" She looked at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. "They found no locket," Miss Marple said quietly. "His pockets were quite empty. That is why they suspect robbery." Relief flooded Susan's face with such intensity that it was painful to witness. Yet as the girl hurried away, Miss Marple's thoughts grew increasingly troubled. A missing locket, a jealous suitor, a victim who enjoyed tormenting young women. It formed a pattern that was almost too neat, too obviously constructed. It was precisely the sort of solution that Inspector Slack would embrace with enthusiasm. That afternoon brought her to the vicarage once more, where she found Griselda in the morning room, her hands busy with mending, but her needle pricking her fingers repeatedly, leaving small, bright drops of blood on the white fabric. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling into her accustomed chair, "you really are distressed. Perhaps you might tell me about the locket." Griselda went very still, her needle suspended in mid-air. "Locket? The one Mr. Latimer took from Susan Trent. I believe you know something about it." For a long moment Griselda said nothing. Then, in a voice so low Miss Marple had to strain to hear it, she whispered, "It's in my escritoire, in the secret drawer. He gave it to me the morning he died, said it was insurance against certain complications." Miss Marple nodded as though this merely confirmed something she had suspected all along. The pieces were shifting, revealing a picture far more complex than Inspector Slack's simple theory of desperate youth and violent impulse. The truth lay not in obvious passion, but in something colder, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone yet suspected. The silence that followed Griselda's confession stretched between them like a taut wire. Miss Marple continued her knitting with steady, rhythmic movements, allowing the younger woman time to compose herself. She had learned long ago that people, when given sufficient quiet, often revealed far more than they intended. "There is something else," Griselda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Mr. Latimer, about why he came here, to St. Mary Mead specifically." She twisted her handkerchief between her fingers, leaving small, damp creases in the fabric. "Before I married Leonard, I was engaged to someone else. The engagement ended badly. There were accusations, a terrible scandal that my family managed to hush up. I came here to start fresh, and Leonard never knew." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "And this former fiancé?" "Richard Vance, the same Mr. Vance who has taken Blackwood Hall." Griselda's voice grew stronger, as though the admission had somehow freed her. "Mr. Latimer discovered the connection. He delighted in arranging for Richard to visit him here, watching us pretend to be strangers. Afterward, Richard came to me in desperation. He said Latimer had been blackmailing him for months, threatening to expose certain business dealings that weren't entirely proper." "I see." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her mind was working with considerable intensity. "And Mr. Vance asked for your help?" He wanted me to search Latimer's room for the documents he held. I refused, of course. I told him he must handle his own affairs. That was 3 days before the murder." Miss Marple rose slowly, her joints protesting the movement. "My dear, might I examine that locket once more?" Griselda retrieved it from the escritoire with trembling hands. This time, Miss Marple studied it more carefully, turning it toward the window light. The forced catch, the empty interior, the faint, dark smudge on the inner rim, all spoke of recent and urgent handling. But it was something else that caught her attention, a tiny fragment of paper, so small it might have been overlooked, caught in the hinge mechanism. With infinite care, she extracted the fragment with the tip of her knitting needle. It was no larger than a child's fingernail, but the partial letters visible were enough. Onk of Eng, and below that, £1,000. "A bank draft," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps a promissory note? Something that would fit quite neatly inside a locket, folded very small." Griselda stared at the fragment. "But if that was his insurance, why give the locket to me?" "Because, my dear, he needed someone above suspicion to hold it. A vicar's wife would never be searched by the police. The locket itself was meaningless. It was what was inside that mattered." Miss Marple slipped the fragment into her reticule, alongside the mother-of-pearl button she had found. "Tell me, when exactly did Mr. Vance visit Mr. Latimer?" "Last Tuesday afternoon. They spoke for perhaps half an hour. When Richard left, he looked dangerous. I'd never seen him like that before." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She was beginning to see the shape of things, though several pieces remained frustratingly elusive. A man using multiple identities, blackmailing former associates, carrying valuable documents, and inspiring murderous rage in at least 2 people she knew of. The question was not who might have wanted Gerald Latimer dead, but rather who had possessed both the opportunity and the cold nerve to act upon that desire. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the morning-room window. The view commanded an excellent prospect of the lane leading to Blackwood Hall, and something had caught her eye. Mr. Vance's motor car was approaching at considerable speed, dust rising behind it in an agitated cloud. But it was not the car that interested her. It was the figure walking rapidly along the hedgerow, clearly attempting to avoid being seen from the road. Mary, the vicarage maid, was returning from the village with obvious haste, clutching something to her chest. As she drew nearer, Miss Marple could see it was an envelope, thick, official-looking, and bearing what appeared to be a London postmark. The girl's face was flushed with excitement rather than fear, and there was something in her manner that suggested triumph rather than distress. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured to herself, watching as Mary slipped through the servants' entrance with the stealth of long practice. Another piece of correspondence, another secret. The web of deception surrounding Gerald Latimer's death was proving far more complex than Inspector Slack's simple theory of robbery suggested. She thought of the mother-of-pearl button in her reticule, of the paper fragment, of the various threads of blackmail and desperation that seemed to emanate from the dead man like spokes from a wheel. Someone in their quiet village possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness to commit calculated murder. The challenge now was to determine who had moved from desperate fear to deadly action, and why they had chosen that particular night to strike. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, was often hidden not in what people said, but in what they were most careful not to say. And in St. Mary Mead, the silence was growing more eloquent by the hour. That evening, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Dr. Haydock, who had called ostensibly to check on a slight cough, but clearly had other matters weighing on his mind. He settled into her sitting room with the air of a man carrying troublesome knowledge. "I've been thinking about that wound," he said without preamble. accepting the tea she offered. The angle was peculiar, perfectly horizontal, as though victim and attacker were of identical height. Latimer was 5 feet 11 inches. That narrows our field considerably. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Indeed it does. And there were other details? Traces of lavender water on his collar, the sort a working girl might use. Dr. Haydock's expression was grim. I've also learned something disturbing about his promises to Mary's brother. I contacted a colleague in London. No such assistance was ever offered. Pure fabrication, designed to gain the girl's trust. After the doctor departed, Miss Marple reflected on these revelations. A man of specific height, traces of a servant's perfume, lies told to vulnerable young women. The picture was becoming clearer, though it raised as many questions as it answered. The next morning brought fresh gossip through the village's reliable network. Mrs. Hartwell, emerging from the post office, could barely contain her excitement as she encountered Miss Marple near the war memorial. "My dear Miss Marple, have you heard about Mary? The vicarage maid has given notice just like that." And Mrs. Prescott saw her at the railway station, asking about ticket prices to London, wearing a coat far too fine for her station, if you ask me. Miss Marple absorbed this intelligence with interest. A sudden departure, unexpected prosperity, and a destination that suggested flight rather than mere employment change. The pattern was becoming familiar. Her meditation was interrupted by the sight of Mr. Vance's motor car pulling up outside the Blue Boar. She positioned herself strategically near the milliner's window, from which vantage point she could observe the heated conversation that ensued between Vance and Susan Trent. "I tell you, I saw nothing." Susan's voice carried clearly across the street, high with fear. "Leave me alone." Vance gripped her arm, his face contorted with desperate urgency. "Don't play the innocent with me. Latimer told me you had it. Where is it?" The arrival of Constable Pork sent Vance retreating to his car, but not before Miss Marple had noted the cold calculation in his eyes, the look of a man who would stop at nothing to recover what he sought. Later that afternoon, she encountered Vance himself on the lane leading to Blackwood Hall. He greeted her with careful courtesy, but she observed the tension in his bearing, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Such a terrible business about Mr. Latimer," she said gently. "You knew him well, I understand?" "Acquaintance only," Vance replied curtly. The man had a talent for inserting himself into other people's affairs. "I came here for peace and quiet, not to deal with his particular brand of usefulness." "Usefulness can be such a double-edged quality," Miss Marple observed. "I suppose he was useful to many people, in various ways." Vance's smile was without warmth. "He tried his tricks with me once. It ended badly for him." "Some people mistake forbearance for weakness, Miss Marple." "It's a dangerous error." As he drove away, Miss Marple pondered his words. A man who admitted openly to having thwarted Latimer's schemes was either remarkably innocent or supremely confident in his position. Her thoughts were interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival at the vicarage, bearing news that sent fresh ripples through the investigation. He had discovered a man's handkerchief near the crime scene, fine linen monogrammed with the initials R.V. "Missed it in the initial search," he announced with satisfaction. "Found it snagged on a bramble this morning. Looks like our Mr. Vance has some explaining to do." Miss Marple examined the evidence bag with interest. The handkerchief was still damp, though it had supposedly lain there since the night of the murder. "Inspector," she said carefully, "had you considered that evidence appearing so conveniently might have been placed there deliberately?" Slack bristled. "Evidence is evidence, Miss Marple. I don't deal in theories." But Miss Marple was already thinking beyond the obvious implications. Someone was working very hard to direct suspicion toward Vance. The question was whether that someone was the true murderer, or merely another victim of Latimer's schemes seeking to deflect attention from their own secrets. As evening approached, she made her way to the vicarage once more, only to discover that Mary had vanished entirely, leaving behind only her cap and apron. On the kitchen floor lay a single grey leather glove, the sort she had seen Tom Ellison wearing only yesterday. The web was tightening around multiple suspects, but the spider at its centre remained hidden, pulling strings with deadly precision. The discovery of Tom's glove in the vicarage kitchen sent Inspector Slack into a state of barely contained triumph. He stood in the cramped space between the scullery sink and the coal range, holding the grey leather item as though it were the crown jewels themselves, his face flushed with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been vindicated by Providence. "There we have it," he declared to the assembled household, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Tom Ellison's glove. I'd know that particular stitching anywhere, and see here, the oil stains from his work at the garage. The boy came back, Mrs. Clement. Came back to silence the girl who knew too much, and dropped this in his haste to escape." Miss Marple, positioned near the kitchen door, where she could observe both the inspector's theatrical display and Griselda's increasingly pale face, regarded the evidence with the sort of mild interest she might have shown to a particularly obvious piece of needlework. "How very convenient," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "One might almost think our murderer wished to be caught." Inspector Slack's chest swelled with indignation. "Evidence is evidence, Miss Marple. I don't deal in fanciful theories about criminal psychology." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed gently, though her pale eyes had taken on that particular sharpness that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as dangerous. "Though I confess I find it remarkable how obliging this particular criminal has been. First, Mr. Vance's handkerchief appearing so conveniently on a bramble, now Tom's glove materializing in precisely the spot where it would cause maximum suspicion. It's almost as though someone wishes us to chase our tails." Within 2 hours, Tom Ellison had been arrested at his place of employment, his protestations of innocence falling on deaf ears as he was bundled into the police motorcar. The village watched from behind curtains and over garden gates as the young man was driven away, his face white with shock and his mother's cries echoing down the high street. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while her mind worked through the accumulating evidence. 3 separate pieces of incriminating material, each appearing at precisely the right moment to implicate a different suspect. It reminded her forcibly of a case she had once observed involving a poisoning in little paddocks, where the murderer had been so clever at misdirection that the police had arrested 4 innocent people before the truth emerged. The evening brought vindication of her suspicions in the most dramatic fashion possible. She was taking her customary cup of cocoa before bed when Constable Pork's frantic knocking roused the entire village. There had been a break-in at the vicarage, not a robbery, but a deliberate search of the Reverend Clement's study, with particular attention paid to the escritoire where Griselda had mentioned keeping various household documents. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage to find chaos. The study windows had been shattered, the desk ransacked, and papers scattered across the Persian carpet like fallen leaves. Most significantly, the secret drawer that had contained Susan's locket had been forced open with considerable violence. "The locket!" Griselda whispered, her face ashen in the lamplight. "They were after the locket." "Which you moved to the pantry yesterday, following my suggestion?" Miss Marple observed with satisfaction. "So our intruder has failed in their primary objective, but more importantly, Constable Polk, this proves beyond any doubt that Tom Ellison is innocent." The constable, still struggling to process this latest development, scratched his head in bewilderment. "How's that, Miss Marple?" "Because, my dear man, Tom has been locked in a cell in Much Benham since this afternoon. He could hardly break into the vicarage while under police custody. We are dealing with someone else entirely, someone who knew exactly where to look for the locket, and who has grown desperate enough to take considerable risks." Dr. Haydock, who had arrived to tend to Griselda's shock, knelt beside the shattered desk and held up a small object. "There's this as well," he said grimly, "caught on a splinter of wood." It was a fragment of dark cloth, fine wool, expensive, with a distinctive weave that Miss Marple recognized immediately. She had seen that particular fabric only yesterday, adorning the sleeve of a coat whose owner had been most careful to appear cooperative while revealing nothing of substance. More telling still was what she discovered beneath the overturned chair. A small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with cryptic notations in a careful hand. The entries were dates and initials, sums of money, and what appeared to be a careful record of various transactions. One entry, dated 3 days before the murder, caught her attention immediately. "GC, final warning delivered. Payment overdue. Consequences explained." "GC," Miss Marple murmured, glancing at Griselda's frightened face. "I believe, my dear, that someone has been keeping very careful records indeed. And I suspect that when we examine this notebook properly, we shall find that Mr. Latimer was not the only person in St. Mary Mead engaged in the business of extracting money from those who preferred their secrets to remain buried." As the constable prepared to telephone Inspector Slack with news that would shatter his neat theory, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. The murderer had made their first serious mistake, driven by desperation to take action that revealed far more than they had intended. The careful web of misdirection was beginning to unravel, and with it, the true face of a killer who had hidden behind a mask of respectability while orchestrating a campaign of terror that had culminated in murder. The game, as she had learned to recognize over many years of observation, was entering its final phase. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the vicarage in a considerably different frame of mind than his previous visit. The notebook lay open on the study table, its pages revealing a web of corruption that seemed to implicate half the respectable families in the district. His earlier confidence had evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the grim realization that his simple theory of desperate youth and violent impulse had been thoroughly demolished by the previous night's break-in. Miss Marple, seated beside the window with her knitting, observed the inspector's discomfort with sympathetic interest. "The handwriting is quite revealing, don't you think?" she remarked, gently indicating a particular page. "Notice how it changes approximately 3 months ago. The early entries are bold, rather careless, presumably Mr. Latimer's hand. But these later ones show a completely different character. Smaller, more controlled, with a distinctive flourish to the capital letters that suggests considerable education." Dr. Haydock, examining the notebook over the inspector's shoulder, nodded grimly. "2 different people, without question. It appears our Mr. Latimer may have found himself in the same position as his victims, being controlled by someone who had discovered his activities. The entries painted a damning picture of systematic extortion. RV appeared regularly with substantial monthly payments. ST showed no monetary transactions, merely threats and leverage. TE was documented with notes about gambling debts that could destroy his employment. Most significantly, MH appeared throughout the later entries, but with payments flowing to her rather than from her. "Mary was not a victim," Miss Marple observed quietly. "She was an informant. A servant in the vicarage sees everything, hears everything. She would have known about Mrs. Clement's past connection to Mr. Vance, about the various secrets that made people vulnerable. She was being paid for information." Inspector Slack's face darkened as the implications became clear. Then when Latimer was killed, she realized she'd become a liability to whoever was really running this operation. The revelation was interrupted by Constable Polk's arrival with news that sent fresh ripples through the investigation. He had located Mary at her sister's house in Milchester, where she had been found in a state of near collapse, clutching a crumpled envelope bearing 3 words in her own trembling handwriting: "I saw him." By afternoon, Miss Marple had made her way to Blackwood Hall, carrying with her the fragment of dark cloth found at the vicarage. She discovered Richard Vance in the rose garden, pacing with the jerky movements of a man whose nerves had been stretched beyond endurance. When she produced the fabric, his face went ashen. "I suppose you've told the police," he said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Not yet. I prefer to understand the complete truth before involving officialdom." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but implacable. "You broke into the vicarage. You were searching for something specific." The confession poured out of him like water from a broken dam. The forged bank draft, the months of blackmail, his desperate attempt to recover the evidence that could destroy him. But when Miss Marple pressed him about the murder itself, his response was immediate and convincing. "I wanted to kill him, God knows I did, but I didn't have the courage. I paid him another £100 that night and left him laughing at me. But as I walked back to the hall, I looked over my shoulder. There was someone else on the path, someone in a heavy coat, moving very quickly toward where I'd left him." Miss Marple absorbed this information with satisfaction. Another piece of the puzzle, confirming what she had begun to suspect. Vance was the burglar, but not the murderer. The crimes were connected by their victim, but separated by their perpetrators. Returning to the village, she made a strategic stop at the post office, where Mrs. Price Ridley was conducting her usual reconnaissance mission, disguised as purchasing stamps. Miss Marple positioned herself carefully within earshot of the other customers. "Such a relief about poor Tom being released," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "And that notebook from the study. Inspector Slack believes the later entries are indecipherable, but I rather think he's mistaken. It appears to be a simple substitution cipher. I used to solve them for my uncle, the Admiral." Mrs. Price Ridley's ears practically twitched with interest. "You can read it?" "I believe so. I should have the complete translation ready by tea time. It names everyone, you see, including the person Mr. Latimer met on his final night." Miss Marple lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried perfectly. "I intend to present my findings to the vicar this afternoon. It seems only proper that the truth should come out in the house where the poor man lodged." As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected on the trap she had set. The news would spread through St. Mary Mead faster than any telegraph, carrying with it the message that Jane Marple held the key to the killer's identity and planned to reveal it within hours. It was a dangerous gambit, but necessary. The murderer had been extraordinarily clever, hiding behind a facade of respectability while orchestrating a web of fear and extortion. But desperation, Miss Marple knew, often drove even the cleverest people to make fatal mistakes. She settled into her cottage to wait, the mother-of-pearl button gleaming on her mantelpiece like a silent accusation. Somewhere in their quiet village, a killer was making a final desperate decision. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Miss Marple settled herself in her sitting room, the notebook spread open before her with deliberate prominence. She had spent considerable time that morning ensuring that word of her breakthrough with the cipher would reach the proper ears, and now she waited with the patient stillness of an angler who knows the fish is already circling the bait. Her preparation had been meticulous. The mother-of-pearl button lay beside the notebook, catching the lamplight with its telltale chip. The fragment of bank draft paper rested in a small envelope marked "Evidence" in her careful script. Most importantly, she had arranged for Inspector Slack to position himself in the garden shed, though she had been deliberately vague about when his presence might be required. The soft knock at her door came precisely at 5:30, neither early enough to suggest eagerness, nor late enough to imply reluctance. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she called out her gentle invitation to enter. Mrs. Price Ridley stepped into the sitting-room with her customary air of authority, though Miss Marple's trained eye detected the subtle signs of strain beneath the composed exterior. The older woman's gloves were pulled too tight, her handbag clutched with unnecessary firmness, and there was a brightness to her eyes that spoke of nerves stretched to their breaking point. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley said, settling herself into the offered chair with careful precision, "I do hope you don't mind my calling so late in the day. I heard the most extraordinary rumours about your success with that dreadful notebook." "Oh, it wasn't nearly so difficult as people seem to think," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking with their usual rhythm. "A simple substitution cipher, really, though the contents were quite illuminating once one understood the pattern." Mrs. Price Ridley's gaze fixed on the open notebook with an intensity that might have seemed merely curious to a less observant eye. "And you've truly deciphered all of it? Every entry?" Indeed. The early entries were Mr. Latimer's work, of course, rather crude attempts at record-keeping for his blackmail enterprise. But the later entries show a completely different hand. Someone far more organized, more systematic, someone who understood that information properly managed could be infinitely more valuable than crude threats. Miss Marple paused in her knitting to turn a page, her movements deliberately slow and theatrical. The partnership began approximately 3 months ago. The entries show payments flowing in 2 directions, to informants like poor Mary, but also substantial sums to someone identified only as MP. The amounts are quite significant. £50 here, 30 there, far more than a servant's wages. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Price Ridley sat perfectly still, her breathing carefully controlled, but Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted between the notebook and the door. "MP," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "could stand for many things, of course, but when one considers who in our village would have both the social position to observe everyone's secrets and the desperate need for substantial sums of money, the possibilities narrow considerably." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Price Ridley said, her voice maintaining its usual crisp authority despite the underlying tension. "Oh, but I think you do, my dear. You see, I've spent considerable time thinking about motivation. Mr. Latimer was greedy, certainly, but he was also fundamentally lazy. The systematic nature of the later operation required someone with both intelligence and intimate knowledge of our little community. Someone who knew, for instance, that Mr. Vance had forged documents in his past, that Susan Trent's mother had secrets worth concealing, that various other residents had vulnerabilities that could be exploited." Miss Marple set down her knitting and picked up the mother-of-pearl button, rolling it gently between her fingers. But partnerships built on mutual criminality are inherently unstable. Eventually, one partner decides they no longer need the other. Mrs. Price Ridley's composure finally cracked just slightly. "You're spinning fantasies, Miss Marple, wild theories based on nothing more than an old woman's imagination." "Am I?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her eyes had taken on that steely quality that those who knew her had learned to recognize. "Then perhaps you can explain this button? I found it near my garden gate the morning after the murder. It's quite distinctive. Mother of pearl, with hand-carved edges and a small chip just here. I remember admiring the complete set on your gardening coat at the church fête." The older woman's face had gone very pale, but her voice remained steady. "Buttons come loose. It proves nothing. Taken alone, perhaps not, but combined with the other evidence, the handwriting analysis, the payment records, the systematic misdirection of suspicion toward first Tom, then Mr. Vance, it forms a rather compelling picture." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You killed Mr. Latimer because he had become a liability. He was growing careless, making demands, threatening to expose the partnership unless you increased his share of the profits." Mrs. Price Ridley rose abruptly, moving toward the window with jerky, agitated steps. "This is absurd. I'm a pillar of this community. I've lived here for 30 years, contributed to every charitable cause, supported every worthy endeavour." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed sadly, "and maintaining that position became increasingly expensive after your husband's death left you with nothing but debts and a reputation to preserve. The house, the servants, the donations expected of someone in your position, it all required money you didn't have. When you discovered what Mr. Latimer was doing, you saw an opportunity." The confession, when it came, poured out with the bitter force of long-suppressed truth. Mrs. Price Ridley turned from the window, her face a mask of fury and desperation, all pretense of respectability finally abandoned. "He was a fool," she spat, "a greedy, stupid fool who thought he could dictate terms to me. I gave him everything, every secret, every vulnerability in this village. I turned his crude little scheme into a proper business. And how did he repay me? By laughing at me, calling me a dried-up old woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps he threw my way." Miss Marple nodded with something approaching compassion. "So you arranged to meet him that night, told him you had his increased payment?" "I told him I had £200, more than he'd ever seen at once." The greedy pig came running like a dog to a bone. When he bent down to examine the envelope, I struck him with the brass candlestick from my hall table. It was over in seconds. And then you began the careful work of misdirection. Tom's glove, strategically placed, Mr. Vance's handkerchief conveniently discovered, the break-in at the vicarage to suggest Mary's involvement. Very clever, but ultimately too clever. The evidence appeared too conveniently in too neat a sequence. Mrs. Price Ridley laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And what good does your cleverness do you now, Miss Marple? You're an old woman alone in a cottage with a murderer. Who's to say you didn't have an unfortunate accident while working in your garden?" But Miss Marple was already reaching for the small bell beside her chair. "Inspector Slack," she called clearly, "I believe we have heard quite enough." The inspector emerged from the kitchen where he had been listening through the thin wall, his face grim with the satisfaction of a case finally resolved. As he placed the handcuffs on Mrs. Price Ridley's wrists, she maintained her defiant posture to the end. "You think you've won," she said to Miss Marple as they led her away. "But I regret nothing except not killing him sooner." After they had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Another case closed, another murderer exposed, but the victory felt hollow. Mrs. Price Ridley had been a neighbour, a woman she had known for decades, someone who had sat in church pews and served on committees and maintained the facade of respectability while nurturing a heart as cold as winter stone. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, picking up her needles once more. Such a very dangerous thing to underestimate. The evening shadows lengthened across her sitting room as Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles a small comfort against the darkness that could lurk behind even the most respectable facades. In St. Mary Mead, as everywhere else, the capacity for evil could flourish in the most unexpected places, hidden behind lace curtains and charitable donations until desperation finally stripped away all pretense. The truth, as always, had been far more complex and far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The days following Mrs. Price Ridley's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to St. Mary Mead, the kind of stunned silence that follows a thunderclap. The village moved through its familiar routines with careful deliberation, as though everyone feared that sudden movements might shatter what remained of their collective composure. That such calculated evil could have flourished behind lace curtains and charitable subscriptions was a revelation that struck at the very heart of their assumptions about respectability and human nature. Miss Marple found herself called upon frequently during those first difficult days, her presence somehow reassuring to neighbours who had begun to question their own judgment. It was during one such visit to the vicarage that Griselda finally unburdened herself of the secret that had been consuming her since the night of the murder. "I heard it," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, as they sat in the morning room where so much of the tragedy had unfolded. "The scream, that night. I heard it clearly and I did nothing." Miss Marple set down her teacup with gentle precision. "You were frightened and uncertain, my dear. That is perfectly natural. But if I had acted, if I had woken Leonard or gone to the window, might Mr. Latimer still be alive? Might all of this have been prevented?" Griselda's hands twisted in her lap, the guilt she had carried finally finding voice. "No," Miss Marple said firmly, with more authority than she usually allowed herself. "You must not torment yourself with such thoughts. Mrs. Price Ridley had already chosen her path. Your actions that night would not have changed her heart or her desperation. At worst, you might have become another victim." The confession seemed to lift a weight from Griselda's shoulders. When Leonard entered the room moments later, she told him everything. About the scream, about her former engagement to Vance, about the blackmail that had entangled them all. His response was characteristically practical. He was only sorry she hadn't confided in him sooner, and far more concerned with the immediate problem of finding a replacement for Mary than with dwelling on past troubles. Inspector Slack arrived that afternoon to collect final statements, his manner considerably more humble than it had been at the investigation's beginning. He found Miss Marple in her garden, tending to her roses with the same methodical care she applied to all complex puzzles. "I owe you an apology, Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "I was too quick to accept the obvious answers, nearly sent innocent men to the gallows." "The fault lies with Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple replied kindly, not pausing in her pruning. "She understood exactly how to manipulate expectations. She counted on you looking for dramatic motives and obvious suspects, not at a respectable widow who had spent 30 years cultivating an unassailable reputation." "How did you know to suspect her?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "It was the accumulation of small inconsistencies. She knew about the timing of the scream before anyone had publicly discussed it. She watched people with calculating intensity rather than mere nosiness, and the planted evidence appeared too conveniently: Tom's glove, Vance's handkerchief, the break-in designed to implicate Mary. It was almost theatrical in its obviousness. As the inspector departed, Miss Marple reflected on the broader implications. A woman of impeccable breeding had committed cold-blooded murder, then systematically attempted to destroy innocent lives to protect herself. It served as a sobering reminder that evil often wore the most respectable faces. The village was already beginning to heal. Tom Ellison walked openly with Susan Trent now that suspicion had been lifted from them both. Mr. Vance had quietly departed for London, selling Blackwood Hall to a retired colonel who showed no interest in village gossip or mysterious nocturnal meetings. The various committees and charitable organizations were reorganizing themselves with determined efficiency, as though by maintaining their routines they could somehow restore the innocence that had been lost. But Miss Marple knew that something fundamental had changed. The residents of St. Mary Mead had learned that monsters could live among them undetected, hiding behind garden party conversations and missionary tea subscriptions. It was an uncomfortable lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair beneath the laburnum tree, her knitting needles clicking their familiar rhythm. She picked up the mother-of-pearl button from her work-basket, examining once more the small chip that had helped unravel a murderer's carefully constructed facade, then dropped it back among her wool and patterns. The case was closed, justice had been served, and life would continue its eternal dance of human comedy and tragedy. But Miss Marple remained watchful, her understanding of the human heart deeper than ever. Mrs. Price Ridley's final words, "I regret nothing," echoed in her memory as a reminder of the terrible capacity for self-deception that allowed people to commit monstrous acts while maintaining their belief in their own righteousness. The night Griselda heard the scream and said nothing had indeed changed everything, setting in motion events that exposed the darkness lurking beneath their peaceful village's surface. And though the immediate danger had passed, Miss Marple knew that human nature, with all its capacity for both nobility and wickedness, would continue to provide endless variations on the same eternal themes. Of that she had no doubt whatsoever. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Price Ridley's conviction, and St. Mary Mead wore the careful composure of a village determined to heal. The morning service at St. Mary's proceeded with its customary ritual, yet everyone's eyes avoided the third pew on the left, where for 30 years Mrs. Price Ridley had sat in judgment of choir boys and congregants alike. The empty space seemed to speak louder than her presence ever had, a silent reminder of how thoroughly respectability could mask corruption. Miss Marple, observing from her usual seat toward the back, noted how the vicar's voice caught slightly when he spoke of hidden sins, and how the congregation collectively held its breath. It was the natural reaction of a community that had discovered evil not in some external threat, but in one of their own moral guardians. After the service, she found herself in the vicarage garden with Griselda, who poured tea with hands that no longer trembled. The shadows beneath the young woman's eyes had vanished, replaced by a new maturity born of facing her worst fears. "I still torment myself with that night," Griselda confessed quietly, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple. "The scream I heard and ignored. If I had acted—" "My dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently, her needles clicking with familiar rhythm, "you must not carry that burden. You were a young woman, frightened and uncertain, with a household to protect and—" She paused meaningfully. "A child to consider." Griselda's cup rattled against its saucer. "You knew?" "The way you've been carrying yourself these past weeks, the morning pallor, the looseness of that green frock you favour." Mrs. Price Ridley would have noticed as well. A vicar's wife, expecting her first child, with questionable connections to a gentleman like Mr. Vance, such knowledge would have been valuable currency in her business. The confession seemed to lift years from Griselda's shoulders. "I was so terrified of scandal, of Leonard learning about Richard. I convinced myself the scream meant nothing, that I was imagining things." "Your silence was born of human frailty," Miss Marple said firmly. "Hers was born of calculation. You heard death and were paralyzed by natural fear. She caused death and felt only the satisfaction of a problem eliminated. There is a world of difference between the two." The following afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Mary, the former vicarage maid, appeared at her door looking considerably more prosperous, her coat new, and her manner guarded but determined. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," Mary said, accepting the offered tea. "For not mentioning my part to the inspector. I know you could have." "You were young and foolish, my dear, exploited by a woman who understood exactly how to manipulate such weaknesses. You provided gossip, nothing more. You couldn't have known it would end in murder." Mary's voice trembled. "But I should have realized something was wrong when Mr. Latimer started asking the same questions, wanting the same information." "We all have our vulnerabilities," Miss Marple observed kindly. "The important thing is learning from our mistakes. Have you found new employment?" "A position in London, with a family that knows nothing of St. Mary Mead. I leave tomorrow, but I wanted you to know. I understand now what you were trying to tell me about his promises. You knew even then they were false." After Mary departed, Miss Marple sat in contemplation. The case had revealed uncomfortable truths about the ease with which evil could flourish behind charitable subscriptions and committee work. Mrs. Price Ridley had not been an aberration, but a warning. Pride and desperation could transform anyone into a calculating killer. Yet there were consolations. Griselda had found the courage to confess her fears and rebuild her marriage on honesty. Mary had recognized her mistakes and sought redemption. Even the village itself was healing, new faces filling committee positions, new voices leading charitable work. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked slowly through streets that appeared unchanged, neat cottages, well-tended gardens, neighbours pursuing their ordinary business. But she knew, as did everyone who had lived through these terrible weeks, that appearances could be profoundly deceiving. The capacity for evil existed everywhere, hidden behind pleasant smiles and moral authority, waiting for the right combination of desperation and opportunity. But equally, the capacity for justice, courage, and redemption flourished as well. The night Griselda heard the scream and said nothing had set terrible events in motion, but it had also revealed truth about a woman whose respectability masked a heart capable of murder. Miss Marple settled into her chair beneath the laburnum tree, her knitting needles resuming their eternal rhythm. The case was truly closed now, its lessons absorbed, its wounds beginning to heal. She had no illusions that St. Mary Mead would remain forever peaceful. Human nature guaranteed new dramas would unfold, new secrets would fester, new puzzles would demand resolution. But for now there was only the gentle evening light, the soft click of her needles, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice, however delayed, had been served, and she would be here, watching over her world, with the terrible, gentle wisdom of one who sees everything and understands that truth, however uncomfortable, always matters more than the preservation of pleasant illusions.